Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dreamy History, where the past unfolds slowly, gently, to help guide you into rest. Before we begin our quiet journey through time, let's make sure you're comfortable. If you're not already tucked in, take a moment now, adjust your pillow, pull your blanket up to your shoulders, and let your body begin to relax. Dim the lights, silence distractions, and allow the weight of the day to fade away. Close your eyes if you like, or let them slowly blink shut as you listen. Tonight, we'll be drifting into the quiet, orderly corridors of the Byzantine Empire, not into its battles or intrigues, but into the calm, precise world of its bureaucratic court procedures. You'll hear about golden ink and wax seals, quiet footsteps in marble halls, and the slow rhythm of scrolls being copied, carried, and catalogued. Let's begin. In the early hours of the day, just as the faintest traces of light began to stretch across the sky over Constantinople, Theodorus, a mid-level clerk in the imperial bureaucracy, began his daily journey. The street he walked each morning had not changed in years. The cobblestones were worn smooth from decades, if not centuries of sandals, cartwheels, and horseshoes passing the same route. Each stone bore the faint indentations of time, as if history itself had pressed its finger down upon the city. Theodorus stepped lightly, not out of haste, but because he had memorized each uneven gap between the stones. He passed the same merchant stands, not yet open, their canopies tied in neat folds. The olive vendor had already begun sorting her baskets, her movements as mechanical as his own. The same stray cat rested on the same doorstep, its ears flicking at sounds only it could hear. The morning air was cool, not cold, and carried the scent of distant hearths being lit for breakfast porridge. Theodorus inhaled once, evenly, then again, slowly. The rhythm of his feet matched the rhythm of his breath. With each passing building, the imperial palace came closer, its high walls unadorned yet unmistakably vast. The journey was neither long nor short, but simply what it was, an unchanging pattern, a necessary precursor to the repetition that would follow inside the stone halls of imperial routine. Upon arrival at the lesser-used northern entrance of the palace, Theodorus entered through what was known informally among clerks as the Shadow Gate. It was a small, narrow doorway, lacking ornamentation, but it was a direct route to the record-keeping wing of the imperial complex. The door creaked faintly, not out of disrepair, but from regular use. Inside, the corridor was lit by wall-mounted oil lamps, spaced precisely 10 cubits apart, their light flickering against the limestone walls in slow undulation. The walls bore no mosaics, only the faint soot stains from decades of smoke rising from the same torches. Upon entering the scribal chamber, Theodorus performed the same motions he had performed for 12 years. He removed his wool cloak, which he folded twice, exactly along its seams, and hung upon a lion-head bronze hook, designated by nameplate, though the names had long faded. The chamber was rectangular, with desks arranged in parallel rows, always facing the east wall, where the imperial crest two-headed eagle, wings lowered, remained partially obscured by dust, but still unmistakable. The desks themselves were made of dark cedar, worn smooth from the arms of hundreds of scribes who had sat there before him. Nothing in the room had changed, not the layout, not the smell of ink and damp stone, not the low murmur of sandals shuffling quietly on the floor. There was no need for greetings. Everyone had already begun their silent work. To speak without cause was against the unspoken etiquette of the chamber. Theodorus took his seat, opened his case, removed his reed pen, and unrolled the day's first scroll. The work, like the sun outside, was rising. Each morning, Theodorus prepared to copy imperial communications from source to duplicate a task requiring absolute precision. The ink was made in advance by assistance from soot, wine, residue, gum, Arabic, and on formal days, a trace of gold powder added to the solution for provincial governors or ecclesiastical dignitaries. The ink's consistency was thin but not watery, its color rich but not overly bold. Before writing, Theodorus would unroll a new piece of parchment material scraped from calfskin, cleaned with powdered pumice, and cured for several days under controlled tension. He checked it carefully for uneven texture or irregularities. Any mistake in parchment could alter ink flow or render parts of the document illegible. With his left hand, he held a small stratech. With his right, he dipped the reed pen-sharpened calamicin to a narrow inkwell of clay. He began each line with a breath, not a sigh, not a gasp, just a slow, nasal inhalation. He wrote with uniform motion, letters curved and shaped precisely as required by the imperial style. There were no flourishes. There was no personal touch. The script was as mandated by the Hermenia, the official scribal manual, updated last in the reign of Constantine VII. If he made a mistake, he would not strike through. Instead, he would discard the parchment and begin again. That was the rule. Write, pause, blot, breathe, then continue. It was not difficult work, nor was it easy. It was simply the same every day. By midday, the scrolls that had been transcribed, reviewed, and checked were passed to the sealing station. There, another clerk, Marcus 12 years, Theodorus's senior, and known for his unwavering hand, was tasked with applying wax seals. The wax was prepared over a low flame, melted gently in a bronze ladle, with powdered cinnabar added for the appropriate red hue. Marcus would watch the temperature carefully, ensuring it did not bubble or harden prematurely. Once the wax reached the right viscosity, he would pour a carefully measured drop onto the ribbon-wrapped end of the scroll, count silently to 7, and then press the bronze seal of the relevant department directly into the soft wax. Each department, agriculture, tax, provincial registry, had its own seal, all modeled with specific designs. Marcus kept them aligned in a wooden tray by his right hand, each one laid in the same order each day. The seal had to be applied evenly. Tilted pressure could cause an unreadable imprint, which rendered the scroll invalid. Once sealed, the wax was left to cool for precisely 2 minutes, after which the scroll was tied with string and set aside. There were no shortcuts. Marcus did not speak, nor did he look up. His hand moved with mechanical grace, as if time itself passed more slowly at his table, following the sealing process. Theodorus transported the finalized scrolls to the archival chamber, an elongated room carved partially into the palace's western foundation wall. The chamber was dry, slightly cooler than the rest of the building, and lined on either side with recessed alcoves. Each alcove held dozens of scrolls, bundled in groups by region and subject matter, labeled with baked clay plaques stamped in Greek abbreviations. Theodorus approached the alcove labeled Delta Delta Alpha, Delta Iota Omicron, Iota Kappa, Iota Tau, Iota Kappa, Iota Taua, Y, Delta Upsilon, Tau Iota Kappa, Y Sigma Alpha Tau Omicron Lambda Y Alpha Sigma, or administrative orders. Western Anatolia. He carefully lifted the protective cloth, placed the new scroll into its designated position, and recorded the action in a large ledger. The ledger was written on durable papyrus and stored on a central lectern in the archive chamber. He dipped his pen again, noted the scroll number, date, and subject code, and closed the book. The scroll was now officially filed. Its information would remain there until summoned, perhaps years later, or perhaps never. In Byzantium, preservation was not about urgency, but about permanence. At the stroke of midday, a bell muffled, and deliberates dignalled the lunch hour. Theodorus and the others gathered in a narrow refectory adjacent to the scribal wing. The table was long, made of dark walnut, polished once each season with beeswax and oil. Each clerk had a designated spot, not marked by name, but by habit. The same men sat in the same order each day. Their meal was identical: a shallow clay bowl of boiled lentils, a square of coarse bread, a half fig, and watered wine in a cup no larger than a fist. No one spoke unless required. The sounds were predictable: the scraping of spoons, the light tapping of bowls against the table, the occasional throat clearing. A senior scribe, whose name no one remembered saying aloud, always finished first. He wiped his mouth with a cloth, stood, and left in silence. Others followed according to tenure. Theodorus left when he was full, never before, never later. Following lunch, the clerks returned to their workstations. The inkwells were refreshed by junior assistants, using pre-filtered mixtures stored in sealed jars. Theodorus resumed transcription, this time working on a slightly different format: summary logs from the Department of Maritime Levies. These scrolls required more tabulated entries, dates, names, and quantities, all laid out with consistent indentation. The calamus pen was cleaned with wool before switching to the new document. His fingers moved slower in the afternoon, but his accuracy never wavered. Each letter was identical to the last, the spacing regulated by guiding lines etched faintly into the parchment with a bone stylus. Occasionally, a fly would land on the page. Theodorus would wait, never swatting him, till it moved on. Afternoon light poured in at a diagonal, illuminating the dust motes that hovered, suspended, and weightless. The work was the same. The pace was the same. The day was only partially done. As the sky outside dimmed, the scribes prepared to conclude their tasks. Scrolls that were mid-completion were rolled and tagged with a small parchment slip indicating name, date, and word count. Inks were sealed in their containers with beeswax stoppers. Used pens were dried with linen cloth and stored in narrow boxes marked with the owner's initials. Sand was gently sprinkled over fresh ink to assist drying, then brushed off with small wooden fans. Each desk was wiped with a damp cloth and left empty, save for a single candle holder. Theodorus returned his tools to their box, tied the cord around its lid twice, and set it into a drawer built into his desk. He then stood, turned, and bowed slightly to the room, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself. It was a ritual. Then, without word or pause, he walked toward the exit, the same way he had entered. Theodorus stepped into the cool evening air. The streets of Constantinople were quieter now. The cat was awake, sitting atop a barrel near the olive vendor's stall, which was now empty and swept. The light of the moon, filtered through scattered clouds, created shifting patterns on the marble streets. Theodorus walked slowly, his steps even. He did not stop to observe anything, nor did he deviate from his path. He passed the same 3 pillars, the same drying laundry, the same wooden shutter that never quite closed. His home was modest, just outside the second forum. A short walk from the palace. He entered quietly, unlatched the door, removed his cloak, and set his scroll satchel on the same stool he always used. The room was dim. He lit a single lamp, poured a cup of water, and sat down in silence. Tomorrow would be the same. The scrolls would still be waiting. Leo, born in the year 839 in the district of Blocherny, did not come from nobility or even wealth. His father was a seller of wool and goat cheese, but he showed early aptitude in memorization and penmanship. At the age of 9, he was brought by his uncle, a priest, to the Patriarchate's administrative scriptorium, a windowless room at the rear of the ecclesiastical offices. The room was furnished with 3 long writing desks, an oil lamp hanging from a chain, and a cupboard containing wax tablets and styluses. Here, Leo began his apprenticeship under a silent, stone-faced scribe named Anastasios. He was instructed in the crafting of each letter of the majuscule Greek alphabet, which had to be practiced first on wax tablets, softened over candlelight, and later on parchment scraps. Errors were common in the early weeks. Too much pressure would break the stylus, too little would make the letters unreadable. He learned how to align lines by tracing guide marks using a string dipped in powdered soot. The days were long. The lessons were not about speed, but about patience, order, and repetition. His fingers often cramped, but no relief was offered. He was allowed to speak only once per hour, and only if he had a question about grammar. The air in the scriptorium smelled perpetually of beeswax, lamp smoke, and the faint mustiness of cured leather. It was here, in the dim light, that Leo first began to understand the rhythm of clerical life, not through books, but through discipline. The scriptorium never hurried, and neither would he. By the age of 21, Leo was formally assigned to the Imperial Secretariat. The building that housed the Secretariat was located behind the ceremonial gate of the Baucolian Palace, and its stone threshold was worn thin from generations of scribes entering each morning. His desk was the 5th from the door, nearest to the window that overlooked the inner garden, where tortoises were occasionally seen. Leo corrected it with a note written in red ink, followed by the standard marginal abbreviation, SIC. Though he received no formal reward, his attention to detail was noted. The corrected phrasing had averted a mobilization of auxiliary troops which, if assembled, would have drained resources intended for the upcoming harvest levy. The event did not make records. No name was attached to the correction, but within the Secretariat it was known that Leo had caught the error. On average, he processed 17 scrolls per day, though he never rushed. After years of observing inconsistent terminology across departments, especially in translating Latin terms into Greek, Leo began compiling a small reference scroll. He titled it simply Terms of Office and Clerical Titles, Greek to Latin, Latin to Greek. He listed each title with its correct spelling, followed by a standard abbreviation, followed by a list of proper uses in both internal and external correspondence. A junior clerk, curious but not alarmed, was sent to his modest quarters within the clerical dormitories behind the Palace of Daphne. He is mentioned only once in official records, and even that is in a marginal note. Leo, senior clerk, deceased, yet his influence endured not in monuments or edicts, but in habit. These jars were glazed internally to prevent chemical reactions between the ink and the clay, and each was sealed with a wax stopper embedded with the imperial eagle. The jars were then wrapped in linen cloth, numbered, catalogued, and stored in a locked cabinet known within the palace as the kibbutz porphyru. It began with the preparation of the writing surface. typically a sheet of parchment, specially selected from the central archives over centuries. Its vibrant hue oxidized, turning first to a dull rust color, and then, in some cases, nearly invisible to the naked eye. The chest, made of cypress wood and bound in bronze strips, bore the faint Greek inscription Nu Pi Omicron Rho Phi Y Rho Alpha Grampaga, written in purple. Within were 3 scrolls, each wrapped in silk and astonishingly well preserved. They were unrolled under strict supervision. The ink had dulled, but its trace remained legible under candlelight. The documents contained no revelations. One was an administrative directive about grain shipment routes from Bithynia to Thessaloniki. Another recorded the appointment of a minor magistrate in Ankara. The third, a renewal of a fishing tax exemption. Their significance lay not in their content, but in their survival. The ink had neither flaked nor bled. The scroll edges were crisp. The monks noted the scent of the ink still, faintly salty, with a trace of vinegar. A scholar visiting from Smyrna published a quiet article about the find. No one paid much attention, but in the archives a note was made. The ink of emperors, still breathing. The ingredients, organic in nature, reacted to light, moisture, and even the type of parchment upon which they were applied. In the monasteries of Mount Athos and the libraries of Trebizond, scholars noted how certain scrolls, once believed to be blank, revealed faint lettering when exposed to lamplight from an angle. By the 17th century, attempts to authenticate imperial documents relied on not only visual inspection but olfactory cues. Ink, made from murex, retained a faint briny aroma, especially when warmed slightly. Forgeries using beetroot, elderberry, or mulberry ink were detectable not only by their color fade, but by smell, and by the way the ink bled slightly into parchment fibers, whereas true purple ink sat atop the parchment, forming a crust-like texture. To prevent fading, scribes in later centuries began storing purple documents in tin-lined scroll cases, wrapped in linen soaked with cedar oil. Still, the fading continued. It was not viewed as a loss, but rather as part of the ink's life cycle. Just as emperors came and went, so too did the color fade. What remained was the memory, and treated with a solution of alum, powdered pumice, and egg white to create a smooth, slightly glossy surface. Before any writing began, the parchment was laid flat and wiped with a lemon-soaked linen to remove invisible oils from the surface. The writing instrument used was not a common reed pen, but a quill carved from the right wing feather of a white goose, trimmed to a specific width for the ink's viscosity. The ink was not dipped freely. Instead, it was transferred using a dropper made of bone or glass. The clerk never, the emperor would, gently touch the pen to the drop of ink, write one word, and repeat. This ensured that the color and saturation remained uniform. Between each word, the writer paused for exactly 10 seconds to allow the ink to set. This prevented smudging and allowed the pigment to bond with the parchment fibers. Once the writing was complete, the scroll was held aloft to air dry, rotated slowly, and placed on a flat wooden platform lined with linen. A short blessing was then recited, not spoken aloud, but mouthed in silence by the attendant as the document was sealed. The entire process could take up to 2 hours for a single paragraph, but it was never rushed, for to rush would be to risk imperfection, and perfection was the essence of authority. This cabinet, measuring just over 4 feet in height and 2 feet in width, stood within the eastern annex of the Scuffalaciana treasury building adjacent to the Chalk Gate. The cabinet itself was secured with a dual-lock system. One key held by the protovestiarios, the official in charge of the emperor's wardrobe and regalia, and the other by the senior notary of the chancery. No single individual could open it alone. The cabinet was opened only once a month, during the formal signature ceremonies, or when official communication with foreign sovereigns necessitated a written response from the emperor. Every time the cabinet was opened, an entry was made in a wax ledger, noting the time, the reason, the volume extracted, and the names of all present. The temperature in the room was maintained through passive ventilation's small stone ducts designed to keep airflow constant and temperature moderate, thus preserving the ink's chemical stability. Nothing was rushed, nothing was improvised. Even the motion of turning the key required practice. Clerks began to cite him informally when discussing proper format. The emperor himself typically used the ink only to sign documents of significant import, proclamations of succession, formal treaties, or foundational legal reforms. Other signatories required express verbal authorization, often granted in the presence of the Senate or the Synkellos. The ink was not stored at desks or among common supplies. Instead, a servant or eunuch attendant, specially trained in ink handling, brought the sealed jar from the Scuffalacian in a small coffer lined with felt. The ink was unveiled, used, and immediately returned. It was poured into a temporary inkwell, only under watchful eyes. When in use, no other writing materials were allowed nearby, no red ink, no charcoal pens, not even the standard soot ink for annotations. The risk of contamination was considered both physical and symbolic. Documents bearing imperial purple were treated with a layer of beeswax polish to preserve the writing. They were rolled, wrapped, tied, and stamped with seals of gold foil knot wax. These scrolls were stored in scroll cases of inlaid ivory or tortoiseshell and were transported with 2 armed escorts, because in Byzantium, ink was not ink, it was imperial will in liquid form. Leo would not have approved, they would say, when spacing was off or ink too dark. His lexicon, though unsigned, continued to circulate. A desk used by Leo was eventually assigned to another, then another, and became known as Leo's desk. There were whispers that sitting at it brought calm. Whether or not that was true, no one ever sat there without care. His name faded, but his discipline remained. His life, quiet and structured, echoed not in grand gestures, but in margins, in silence, in the steady line of ink. The door was unlatched. Inside, Leo was seated at his desk. His body was still upright, his eyes closed, his hand resting upon a scroll midway through a sentence. His pen had left a faint, trailing line across the parchment where it had slipped. The ink had dried. The room was cold. The scroll was collected, annotated as unfinished, and stored in the personal records file of the Secretariat. His desk was not cleared for a month. Eventually, the tools were passed to another clerk, and the chair was reissued, but the scroll remained untouched. For example, Praefectus Praetorio Orientis was translated as Pi Alpha Rho Omicron Sigma, Tau Nu Pi Rho Alpha, Iota Tau Omega Rho, Y Omega Nu Tau Sigma Nu Alpha, Tau Omicron Lambda Sigma, with a note that the phrase must be capitalized only when used in the first line of a document. His only remark, when asked how he worked so efficiently, was, "I begin, and then I do not stop." A rarity, a regulated material so tightly controlled that only a handful of artisans across the empire were permitted to handle its components. The base ingredient was derived from the murex sea snail, specifically the species Murex trunculus, found along the coasts of Phoenicia and parts of the Aegean. These snails, when extracted from their shells and crushed, though the process was far more intricate than mere crushing, produced a small gland that secreted a colorless fluid. This secretion, when exposed to sunlight, oxidized and turned to a spectrum of colors ranging from crimson to deep violet. The artisans had to be precise in the timing, the drying method, the dilution process, and the storage technique. The ink was mixed with additional agents, including oak gall for thickening, small amounts of vinegar for stabilization, and on occasion, traces of copper sulfate to help fix the color to parchment. But the proportions were never written. The recipe was guarded, often passed orally from master to apprentice within a single family line. Some say the families were never allowed to leave Constantinople. The ink's color, once applied, was like no other, rich, opaque, and immune to standard fading. It was this ink alone that was used in documents signed by the emperor, and the penalty for unauthorized use was as severe as that for counterfeiting coinage. To own a jar of purple ink without approval was a criminal act, and to replicate it without imperial blessing was treason. But very few even tried, because even if one could find the snails, one could not replicate the care, the process, the stillness of the workshop where every drop was prepared in silence. Though it was never declared official, it became the standard reference tool for junior notaries. His eyes strained more easily. His hands ached in the cold. He would arrive each morning at the same hour, walk the same route through the atrium, and sit in his chair before anyone else. He no longer received new assignments. Instead, he was tasked with reviewing scrolls already reviewed, checking not for content, but for form, margin spacing, ink saturation, consistency of signature placement. He maintained the same pace, the same posture, and the same uniformity. Clerks who passed him in the hallway would nod respectfully. Some said his presence alone was a reminder of how the bureaucracy ought to function. He carried no authority, issued no directives, but no one questioned his place. He would sometimes sit quietly with his lexicon, updating a single entry over the course of a week. His breath was shallow, his voice softer than ever, but his presence remained. The younger scribes called him Master of Margins, a nickname never said in jest. He never reacted to it. He simply continued his work. Leo updated it annually, adding annotations, references to legal codes, and sample usages. He kept it rolled in a leather pouch, which he never let leave his desk. Long after his death, fragments of this lexicon were found in other offices, recopied by hand, and stored alongside formal records. It became a footnote in history, unnamed and uncelebrated, but it shaped the court's language in subtle, lasting ways. By now his beard had turned gray at the edges. He wore a plain woolen robe with a narrow blue hem indicating his rank. He still arrived early, still ate lunch alone, and still left only after wiping down his desk. Few remembered when he had first started, but no one remembered a time without him. His supervisor began to pass him more letters, and eventually allowed him to draft first copies. From that point on, Leo's stack of assignments grew taller each day. He still worked silently, still in the fifth seat by the window. But now the other clerks paused before handing him documents. The silence had taken on new meaning. Over the following months, his daily output increased, first 20 lines per hour, then 25, without compromising spacing or legibility. When he was appointed first notary, there was no announcement. He was simply asked to begin using a different wax seal and to sit at the lead desk positioned nearest the supervisor's chamber. His responsibilities shifted slightly. Now, rather than merely copying or reviewing, he had the authority to approve drafts prepared by junior clerks. He was responsible for the ink inventory, ensuring each station's supply remained within the mandated 3 ounces per week. He also oversaw the seasonal resharpening of reed pens, a task that involved boiling the pen tips in vinegar to soften residue, followed by slow scraping with pumice stone. No one praised him aloud, but his name began to circulate quietly within the department. His silence was his strength. He worked 8 hours without complaint. His first major recognition came after he caught an error in a date referencing the start of the fiscal year. These types of letters were formulaic, often reusing phrases from previous years, merely substituting names and dates. As Leo read the Latin phrasing, his eyes paused on a verb form that had been declined incorrectly. The letter implied an imperial demand rather than a request. It was subtle, but diplomatically dangerous. Leo did not alter the content himself. He noted the error in the margin, referenced to precedents from earlier letters, and attached a short index slip for the supervisor. His note read, "Simply verbalis, inversio revisio, commendator." The mistake was corrected. The letter was sent. Weeks passed. Inside, the rooms were lined with hundreds of scrolls stacked in wooden racks, arranged alphabetically and by administrative theme: taxation, maritime trade, agricultural regulation, foreign correspondence. Leo was placed under the supervision of the Deputy Secretary for Correspondence, a man named Michael, known for his monotone voice and tendency to quote the Notitia Dignitatum, the imperial listing of court offices, without prompting. Leo's duties were modest: making second copies of already approved letters, preparing parchment. Instead of April 1st, the original scribe had written April 11th, a 10-day discrepancy that would have misfiled thousands of records. It was in the late autumn of 865 that Leo was handed a routine diplomatic missive intended for the Exarch of Ravenna. Then word arrived through the courier dispatch that the Exarch had taken special notice of the letter S tone. Over the next 20 years, Leo's slow and steady advancement within the court took the form not of promotions accompanied by ceremony or formal recognition, but of changes in his seating assignment and scroll handling privileges. Leo kept a log of all reed pens issued, down to their cut angle. One of Leo's most enduring contributions to the imperial bureaucracy came not from a command or order, but from a personal frustration. This lexicon, initially intended for his personal use, soon spread informally to other clerks, who began copying it word for word. In his later years, Leo no longer wrote as much. On the morning of November 14th, Leo did not arrive. Leo the notary left no heirs. He published nothing under his name. The purple ink used by the Byzantine court, known to scribes and artisans as porphyra, was not merely a substance, it was a symbol once produced. The ink, usually in quantities of no more than 3 or 4 ounces per jar, was poured into ceramic vessels specifically manufactured for the purpose. The privilege of using the imperial purple ink was limited by decree to the reigning emperor, and by extension to no more than 3 designated officials: the protosecretais, the chartularios, to Canaklua, and, on very rare occasions, the logothetes, to Dromu, the head of foreign affairs. The actual usage of the purple ink was guided by an elaborate and choreographed ritual. Despite its initial richness, the purple ink did not last forever. In the year 1734, during a routine cataloging effort in the monastery of Great Lavra on Mount Athos, a chest was found deep within a storage vault. Why purple? Why not gold, or blue, or green? The answer lay in the Byzantine understanding of divine order. Purple was associated with the Roman legacy of imperium, a tradition inherited and transformed by Constantinople. The color, costly and rare, symbolized the intermingling of heaven and earth. Though not used for everyday business, it served as the primary location for high-level court proceedings, audiences, and reviews of petitions. It was a square room with 12 apsidal niches, each designated for a class of official. Each carried a wooden chest, approximately the size of a firewood crate, bound with red-dyed leather and affixed with brass handles. His entrance was not announced. Instead, the sound of the doors opening served as signal. Upon this cue, all present lowered their gaze. These petitions had been compiled by lower scribes, verified by office stewards, and selected through a vetting process that filtered hundreds down to fewer than 10. The reader, dressed in standard mid-rank robes with a blue stripe along the left sleeve, spoke in slow, evenly paced Greek. Their movement was governed not by urgency, but by protocol. The emperor had long since departed, but the rituals continued. You've walked through stone corridors, watched ink dry, and felt the rhythm of scrolls passed hand to hand. As you lie there, wrapped in warmth, remember how far we've come, from the wax-sealed documents of a distant empire to the soft glow of your own quiet night. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts settle. The bureaucrats are at rest. The scribes have left their desks. The purple ink has dried. Sleep now, and may your dreams carry the calm of quiet order. Each department submitted a brief record of completed work, read aloud in the same order as in the morning. Each name called prompted a bow. Scrolls that had not been read were returned to the chests, rewrapped in silk and resealed. The final action of the day was the extinguishing of the ceremonial candlelit each morning and kept burning throughout the workday. The proto-vestiarios extinguished it using a golden snuffer shaped like a dove. At that point, the functionaries exited in reverse order of their arrival. No one spoke, no one looked back. The court day was finished. But the bureaucracy never truly ended. It merely paused. No scroll moved without being signed into a logbook, handed over in person, and filed in triplicate. The routing paths were standard, often determined by long-established channels dating back to previous dynasties. Some scrolls took days to travel a few corridors, not because of delay, but because of sequence. A single scroll about military provisioning might pass through 8 hands before receiving its final seal-each, clerk noting it, checking it, and passing it forward. These scrolls were not bound by covers, but by tightly wound cords dyed to indicate stage of processing. Red cords meant the scroll was pending final review. Yellow cords indicated provisional approval. Scrolls with no cords were not to be touched. Everything had its place. Everyone had their step. Each scroll was unrolled halfway, read aloud to the room, then closed again without comment. The topics varied: requests for tax leniency, appeals against provincial judgments, reports on road maintenance, letters from provincial bishops. Responses from the emperor were not spoken. He would indicate approval or denial through hand gestures. A closed fist meant deferment. An open palm meant approval. A downward-facing hand meant the petition would be referred to the council. These gestures were recorded by an assistant who stood behind a screen and took notes on a wax tablet. The tone was always the same: calm, slow, and neutral, never hurried, never expressive. Then, in unison, they performed the proskynesis, bowing ritual, dictated not by instinct, but by law. Each scroll, still rolled and resealed with fresh wax, was handed to a corresponding official based on subject. These officials were stationed along the perimeter of the room. Upon receiving a scroll, they placed it in their document satchels without opening it. Later, they would take the scrolls to their departmental offices, where responses were drafted and returned for final review. The transfer was always manual: no pages, no servants, only hands of officials, left hand receiving, right hand carrying. Assignments were tracked using lead-tipped styluses on wax boards. Each scroll was given a tracking marker, combination of 3 Greek letters and 2 numerals recorded, both by the sender and receiver. Scrolls that required immediate attention were wrapped with a thin band of green linen. Those that could wait until the next morning were marked with a blue cord. The whole process was smooth, quiet, practice-act, repeated hundreds of times per year with little deviation. Bureaucracy, after all, was Byzantium's longest tradition. Lower officials kneeled. Mid-level functionaries bent forward at the waist. Senior ministers bowed with a slight nod, arms folded in front. The precise degree of bow was outlined in court manuals, such as the Clerologion, which defined gestures by office, rank, and distance from the emperor. The floor of the Chrysotriclinos bore a mosaic with faintly visible concentric circles, indicating where each group should bow. The ceremony was short, no more than 1 minute, but it was considered the axis upon which the day turned. The emperor remained still throughout, eyes rarely moving. His robes shimmered with thread so fine that even the nearest observers could not determine where the hem ended. After the bows, silence continued. The scrolls had not yet been touched. These chests contained that day's scrolls documents to be reviewed, countersigned, or distributed. Each scroll was wrapped in silk, dyed to correspond with its category: purple for imperial mandates, blue for financial matters, ivory for ecclesiastical affairs. The eunuchs placed the chests on a table of porphyry stone set in the exact center of the hall. Then, stepping back 6 paces, they stood motionless. No one approached the table. The act of placing the scrolls was ceremonial, and retrieval would only happen upon instruction from the imperial master of ceremonies. Each chest had a compartmentalized interior lined with felt. The scrolls were tied with linen bands labeled with wax seals. No scroll was read, no seal was broken. They merely sat, resting silently in the center of centuries-old tradition. For the moment, they were symbols in red. Its dome was lined with golden mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin, saints, and previous emperors. Light entered only through narrow, clear-story windows, giving the room a dim, golden glow throughout the day. At precisely the 2nd hour after sunrise, functionaries would begin to arrive, not all at once, but in carefully arranged intervals according to rank. The first to enter were the magistroi, followed by the patricioi, then protosecretikoi, and so on down the list. Each man walked with measured pace, neither too fast nor too slow. Their footwear was regulation: soft leather shoes with color-coded soles for administrators, blue for fiscal officials, green for military liaisons. They stood in assigned positions, determined not by preference but by imperial decree, down to the cubit. None sat unless told. Conversation was rare and conducted in hushed, neutral tones. The room filled slowly, like water into a basin. Silence was the preferred language. Everyone waited, not for the emperor, but for the scrolls. It was said that purple did not belong to mortals, but was borrowed from the robe of Christ himself. Each robe, or camelochion, was issued by the Imperial Wardrobe Department and registered in the official vesting log before a functionary could dress. He was required to consult a steward who would confirm the day's events and corresponding dress code. These instructions were based on both the lunar calendar and the occasion's classification: public audience, restricted council, or private petition. The robes varied in fabric, trim, and ornamentation. Lower clerks wore plain wool with narrow decorative bands. Mid-ranking officials wore silks in deep colors: maroon, lapis, or jade, each with embroidered iconography along the cuffs, scrolls, styluses, palm branches. Senior officials were distinguished by gold thread woven into the seams, though never in excess. Robes were fastened by bronze clasps, each stamped with the symbol of the issuing office. Donning the robe was a slow process, typically taking between 35 and 50 minutes, depending on the number of fasteners and whether the individual had an attendant. Hats known as facialoi were reserved for indoor court duties, and their tilt was regulated by etiquette. 1 degree off-center was considered disrespectful. Thus, the act of dressing was not casual. It was bureaucratic performance clothing as code. For this reason, the porphyra, the marble chamber where empresses gave birth, was lined with purple stone. To be born in the purple porphyra genitos was not merely to be royal, but to be cosmically sanctioned. Thus, using purple ink was not just writing, it was enacting divine order. The act of dipping the pen, writing the name, and sealing the scroll was, in itself, a small ritual bridge between heaven's will and earthly law. Scribes did not speak of it. They did not question it. They merely understood. Purple ink was not decoration. It was theology in liquid form. In the Basilica, the comprehensive law code, compiled under Leo VI Book XL Article 8.5, outlines the regulation. Let none who bears not the title of Basileus, nor he who is instructed by his direct word, apply the ink derived of the shell. Their days were defined not by spontaneity or personal ambition, but by ceremonial position, measured posture, and predictable repetition. In the Byzantine court, every movement was protocol, for if he do so, let his office be revoked, his goods seized, and his name struck. This law, like many in Byzantium, was both literal and symbolic. Violators were punished not only for forgery, but for presumption. To pretend one could speak with imperial authority was to challenge the very order of the cosmos. Enforcement was not frequent. Only a handful of cases are known, but the law stood unchallenged for centuries. Even as other laws were revised, repealed, or ignored, this one remained, not because of its practicality, but because of what it protected. Ink was more than a tool. It was a threshold. This segment focuses on the formal, regulated routines of court officials, those higher in rank than ordinary scribes, yet still bound by layers of custom and hierarchy. The Chrysotriklinos, known in Greek as the Golden Reception Hall, stood as the geometric and ceremonial center of the Byzantine palace complex. Robes in the Byzantine court were not merely clothing, they were visual documents indicating function, status, and authorization. By mid-morning, shortly after the final wave of functionaries had taken position, to eunuchs from the Canoclean the department charged with handling imperial correspondence, centered the Chrysotriclinos. When the emperor finally entered, almost always in silence, he did so through the easternmost door, flanked by 2 guards, and preceded by a curtain-bearer. When the signal was finally given, usually a nod from the logothetes to Dromo, pre-selected reader stepped forward to present the day's petitions. After the petitions were read, scrolls were marked for dispatch. Throughout the day, scrolls continued to move from desk to desk, from office to office, and from hand to hand. As dusk approached, the functionaries returned once more to the Chrysotriclinos. And now, as the flickering oil lamps of the Byzantine court fade into darkness, let your mind return to the present.